Well, I'm Bob Horner. Full name is Robert Murray Horner Jr. And I have always told people that I was born in the most American place you can be born. I was born at George Washington Hospital in Washington, D.C. But my parents were actually living just across the river in Alexandria, Virginia. And that's where I was brought home to, and I've always considered myself a native of Virginia. My dad was in the FBI for most of his career. He was in the FBI at that point and had just been transferred to Washington a year or so before. He had met my mom because she was the youngest of 13 farm children from a little red dirt farm in South Georgia. She got a job at a railway station, and she sold tickets to a couple of bad guys. And the local FBI agent there in Macon, Georgia, learned that she not only had sold them, but remembered meeting them and remembered some things about things they had said. And it turned out they needed her to testify at their trial, which was all the way in San Francisco. So she rode the train out to San Francisco, and the agent who came to meet her was the fellow who turned out ultimately to be my dad. And he escorted her to the trial each day and then got her on the train back home and then wrote her and asked if they could see each other. And as they say, one thing led to the other. But my dad had moved all around the country with the FBI, but I think maybe I came along as the first of 3 children because he had been given a job at headquarters. And that meant he wouldn't have to move around as much. And so maybe they decided it was time to start a family. And that's how it all began and why I grew up in the Northern Virginia area.
So tell us, when were you born? What year? And
1948, November 1948.
Great.
And stayed in Northern Virginia until I graduated from high school. I lived in order in Alexandria, Arlington, and then Fairfax County. Moved there in the 4th grade and lived there until I went off to college. By the time I got out of college, my parents had retired and moved over to the Maryland side of Washington, over on the Chesapeake Bay. But I went to Jeb Stuart High School, which has just recently been renamed as the state of Virginia takes Confederate names off institutions, but it's still there. Before I attended there, I went to St. Anthony's Catholic School in Fairfax County, and was fortunate to have a wonderful childhood, primarily because I had wonderful parents, and wandered all over the state of Virginia. If you grow up in that part of Virginia, I think it's a state law. You have to go to the Manassas battlefield every other month or something, and look for musket balls and things, and did all that. And my dad knew Washington, D.C. very well, so whenever any kind of distant relative came to see us, he personally conducted the tour of Washington. So I would go along and got to see all that neat stuff at the FBI headquarters. If you were a little boy, the highlight was always the firing range. And my dad would take all these folks in the farm all over the city and loved it. And I got to see all that stuff and learn all about that, and was pretty fortunate, I think.
Wow. Well, a very unique upbringing in the nation's capital, and plus the purview that you had with your father kind of being the ultimate tour guide.
Yes. He. I remember when the one couple and their children came up from the Georgia farm and wanted to see the White House, and Dad said, well, we can arrange to go on the tour of the White House. And I honestly forget who was president at that moment, but they wanted to make sure they would see the president. My dad said, well, I actually can't arrange that. They generally don't come with the tour. But
Well, it's interesting the view that people have from the outside, and but
Yep.
you've had a very curious view inside. And what were you interested in high school? What were your areas of interest?
Well, I was interested in no particular order in athletics. I was on the track team, and I became very interested in folk music. Was a craze back then, and started playing at first baritone ukulele, which is sort of a large ukulele, and then guitar and a little bit of banjo, and enjoyed that kind of music. And of course, that sort of ties into the heritage of Virginia, and oddly enough, that made me, I think, a little more history conscious than I might otherwise have been at that age, about learning about where that music came from. And I'm kind of this rarity. I found something and stuck with it my whole life. In my freshman year of high school, my recollection is the English teacher said they're recruiting for the newspaper, and you seem to be a pretty good writer. I think you ought to go over to such and such a teacher and tell them you're interested in being on the newspaper. And I remember telling my dad, and I don't quite know where he came up with it, but he found something about, obviously years before the internet, but somehow he came up with something about the right way to write leads, the first paragraph in a newspaper article, and he showed me that, and he said, you ought to practice this before you go over and see that teacher. So I did, and I don't even know how old you are when you're in the ninth grade, but I was, very young, and the teacher said, hey, you write leads very well, and we think you could figure this out. So they put me on the newspaper, and of course, being in the ninth grade, and my only real interest that you could write about anyway was sports. I ended up on the sports section of the paper, and eventually became sports editor. And with my last name being Horner, of course, I started a column called Horner's Corner, which was kind of inevitable, and would write about sports. And I got jobs through that. I got jobs with a number of the newspapers in the Washington, D.C. area, Northern Virginia, and would cover mainly high school games, and football and basketball and track to some degree, mainly Friday nights, Saturday nights, that kind of thing. And they would actually pay you. And almost nothing, but it was actually, pay. And with the exception of mowing lawns and shoveling snow, I think that was the first, money I ever made. But it wasn't that so much, it's just all the fun of that. And my dad was a very strict guy, and I had a curfew and was expected to behave properly, etc. However, work was kind of a sacred thing, and so because I was working, he let me take a job where I would go down to the old Washington Daily newspaper, which was an old-fashioned tabloid, and I could go down and I would cover like a football game on Friday night. Then I'd go down to the paper, and I would get a ride with somebody down there because I wasn't old enough to drive yet. And the paper's downtown Washington, so I'd cover something in Virginia, go downtown, and I'd work all night helping to put the paper out, and actually put the section together and write headlines and do things that you don't normally get to do when you're that age. And it was the last of the old-time newspaper era. The desk I sat at had a little brass nameplate on it, and it was Ernie Pyle's desk, the great war correspondent. It was just there in the newsroom, and there's no ceremony about it except it still had his name. And I said, is this really that Ernie Pyle? And they said, oh yeah, kid. I said, well, shouldn't there be some, he's not, just, keep writing. And I remembered all the tricks of the trade. The photographer, thank goodness this was not my football game that night, but the photographer had gone to another high school football game between two really good teams that had been decided by a field goal. So somebody won 3-0. But when the photographer went to snap the picture, he missed the field goal. He was too late. So you just saw the kickers follow through, but there was no ball in the picture. And they couldn't use it. And I said, well, I don't, sir, I'm not sure what you want me to write about this. I was supposed to write the caption. He said, oh, wait just a second here. And he took another black and white photograph, cut the football out of it, and pasted it on that photograph. And then that's what went in the paper. So I was already sort of seeing a little bit of the real world of getting something done. But that's really where I got interested in the whole world of reporting and news, and it started with as much as you can love something when you're 8th or 9th grade, I really enjoyed writing, and then it went on to actual reporting, and then being very lucky and getting to see a little bit of the real world to the degree you can understand it when you're that age. That's what really got me interested in the possibility of being in news as a career.
Wow. So you did that all through high school?
All the way through high school, and in my, I guess the end of in those days at least, you didn't start worrying about where to go to college and all that until I guess the end of your junior year, beginning of your senior year, right in there. And I decided that I wanted to study journalism. But there were no public universities in the area or in the state of Virginia that offered an actual journalism degree. There were a couple of places you could take some journalism courses, but they were private schools and the tuition was far beyond us. And I started looking around at other schools that might be affordable, that had good journalism schools, and working at the newspapers, I would ask all of those people, what are the good schools? And so I ended up applying to the University of Missouri, which has the nation's oldest school of journalism, and they would certainly tell you the best. And for an out-of-state school, my parents thought it was within, if I would work while I was at school, et cetera, that it was on the edge of being affordable. So I got accepted there through some miracle, and I got accepted at William and Mary, which is obviously an excellent school, state school, lower tuition, but decided I really wanted to pursue journalism full time, and so ended up going out to Missouri. And that would have been, I guess I graduated from high school in 1966. I started there in the fall of '66.
Something you shared with me that I think is interesting because it's a famous place. Tell us where your high school graduation was, since you were in the Washington, D.C. area.
High school graduation was at Constitution Hall, and that was a real privilege. And I honestly don't know how it got worked out because not every Virginia high school went over there for graduation, but our particular high school started going there for graduation, and it was really interesting because you actually got backstage for a little while, and being able to walk across the stage at Constitution Hall with so many historic things having happened there was probably the thing I remember the most about my high school graduation. I vaguely recall somebody handing me a diploma, but what I really remember was just being there and being on that stage.
Very interesting. So you decided to go to the University of Missouri, and tell us a little bit about that adventure.
Well, I really enjoyed Missouri. My father drove me out there in the station wagon. There used to be something called station wagons. And we drove out there in our station wagon. My younger brother, went along. Took us, 3 or 4 days to get out there because it was before the interstate highway system was really
back roads,
rocking,
yeah.
but it was interesting. and it was interesting. I never visited, and I tell people this now, and with kids today, it doesn't happen, I guess. But I never visited the University of Missouri.
You decided to go there?
I just went there. I never
Yeah.
went to Missouri. I'd never been to Missouri. I'd never been close to crossing the Mississippi River in my life, and I mean, I obviously read a lot about it. I talked to people who had gone there, who were working at newspapers in Northern Virginia, but I had never been there, and mainly in those days you knew things through brochures and, if you're lucky, an occasional magazine and newspaper articles. So I read everything I could and had a rough idea of what the system was, and went out there. And I remember I had maybe 2 old-fashioned foot lockers and I think 1 suitcase, and my brother and I hauled those up to my room in the dorm. And in a coincidence, I guess not entirely a coincidence, a fellow who went to another high school in Northern Virginia but was also a sports writer, and I would see him at all these games. He went to Missouri also for the same reasons, and we ended up getting assigned to the same dorm room. So I sort of knew one guy. I didn't know him really well, but I knew him a little bit. And he was certainly the only person I knew at the University of Missouri. But I started off, you couldn't take journalism courses until your junior year, and you had to have a certain grade point average to get into the journalism school. And I had no discipline. I was not really, to put it mildly, academically inclined, and the only reason I got into Missouri was I was just basically able to get not great grades, but good enough grades in high school without really studying hard. And then, there I was, a place where you actually I discovered to study to do well. But I benefited from really great high school teachers, and skated through some of my freshman courses based on what I already knew from high school. I took a Latin course. I was horrible in math, and for some reason, Missouri put math and foreign language in the same category. You had to take one of those 2 when you were a freshman, and I was afraid to take math, so I took Latin. I'd had 4 years of high school Latin, principally because my father, we were Catholic, and my father had gone to Jesuit high schools and knew Latin and thought Latin was the foundation of all Romance languages, and that's how you started. So he pretty much forced me to take 4 years of high school Latin, at which I was benefiting from having been exposed to really good Latin teachers, and I didn't learn a single thing in that course in college, but passed the course. So I got through that. I took other standard courses, but and did okay in them. But what I remember primarily was getting a job on the student newspaper, which was, because it being the University of Missouri, was different. It was a daily newspaper, and actually a pretty good little paper. And I also got a job on a little student radio station, and started writing news and broadcasting news for that radio station while I was also covering sports for the student newspaper, and somewhere in there decided that I really liked the immediacy of radio, and that I might consider going into the broadcast part of the journalism school if they eventually let me in. But in those days, Vietnam was still going on, and I obviously was draft eligible, and they would draft you in a second if you were not making, I think the wording was something like satisfactory progress towards a degree, which the Fairfax County, Virginia draft board defined as anything below a C. So I came very close to flunking out of geology. And I don't know now why geology didn't interest me. It interests me now, but it didn't then. And so that was a close call, but I passed that one. Other grades were fairly good, and I was able to stay in school. And but my freshman year, I remember the dorm. I remember more about the high school. I'm sorry, the college newspaper and the radio station, but certainly enjoyed it. When I went home that summer, I worked for the newspaper, one of the newspapers I had done sports for, but I switched over to covering news for them. I was sort of a summer vacation relief guy, and learned a lot that summer, and decided I still enjoyed covering sports, but the more serious stuff started to appeal to me, and I started to realize how important that was, and that's where I started to sidle over from covering sports to covering news.
So you go along and you're going to school, and you did enter the military. Were you able to complete your college education first?
Yes, I was very fortunate. I did get admitted to the School of Journalism my junior year, and did better once I got into journalism school than I had been doing, probably because I cared more about it, and worked through my junior and senior years there, and got my degree in journalism. And I had the somewhat unique experience of when I was I want to say it was February or March, I'm not positive, this would have been in 1970, I had managed to get a job at an actual local radio station, not the college station.
And what town was the university?
Oh, it's in Columbia, Missouri, right in the middle of the state. 127 miles east of St. Louis, 127 miles west of Kansas City, right smack in the and roughly in the middle, north-south too, so right in the middle. And I was working at this little radio station in Columbia, KTGR, K-Tiger. Although it's the commercial station, the University of Missouri mascot is the Tiger. They're the Tigers, Missouri Tigers. So I remember going down there and getting that job, and I actually did news there. And I worked it in with my courses and managed not to flunk out, which had been my father's concern, but I needed to make some money to make this affordable for the family, and that was a good way for me to do that. So I was working there, and we covered the very first draft lottery. And for those of you folks who are fortunate enough not to know, what they did was they went to a system where people got drafted by a number, and you got a number based on the date you were born. And somebody in Washington picked those out of, a hat or something.
It looked like a bingo roller.
It was a bingo roller, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, it was.
Sort of like a state lottery sort of thing, or a bingo roller. So so what would happen is the Associated Press and United Press International, UPI, had reporters there, and as quickly as those numbers were picked, they put them on the wire, and we would read the numbers because everybody was desperate to know were they going to be drafted or not. And I remember I read November 20th came up, and I read my own draft number on the air, and there had been a lot of speculation about what numbers would be called by the draft board and which ones were high enough that you wouldn't be called. And I knew that the one I had, 170, was low enough that I was going to get called. So I remember that moment, but the first of many times I realized that sometimes in broadcasting you just have to move on, and you can't worry about your own problems. So, oh man, so I'm going in for sure. But then I carried on and got out of school in June. That was a year where school really kind of ground to a halt in a sense, because there were at the University of Missouri, I wouldn't call them riots, but there were unruly student demonstrations. It was a whole spring and summer of anti-war demonstrations all across the United States.
Anti-Vietnam War.
And Vietnam War. And what happened was sometimes professors, depending on their own political leanings or on the realities of the demonstrations, just quit holding class. And like the last 2 or 3 weeks of my time at the University of Missouri were somewhat disorganized, but made it through, got my degree, and I couldn't get a regular job because the first question they asked you was, well, what's your draft number? And if you gave them the number and they realized, oh, this guy's going in the Army, they wouldn't hire you. And you really couldn't blame them because you would have just been there a few months and why train you or whatever. So I knew I couldn't, although I tried, I couldn't persuade anybody to give me a full-time job. But it turned out my situation was perfect for a really good radio station in St. Louis, which had a very regimented vacation policy at that station, and they made people take vacation in the summer because it enabled them to hire one person to be the vacation replacement for everybody in the news department. So, you know, in June you'd be replacing Bill, and in July you replace John. And so although I don't think I was very good on the air, my air work was I guess barely good enough to get me that job, and my writing was pretty good. So I got a job at KXOK Radio in St. Louis on West Pine Street, I remember, and moved there and worked there all summer. So I started the moment I got out of school, and then Labor Day was the last day all these guys took vacation, and then the day after Labor Day, they kicked you out. But then I really was kind of stuck because I couldn't figure, nobody would hire me from September until whatever this vague day was that I would get drafted. So I really had, while I was at school in Missouri, had gone west a couple times out to see friends in Colorado, had really started to get interested in the West. So I got in a car and wandered around the West for a couple of months, and eventually figured, well, I better go on home because I'm going to get drafted, and who knows where I'll be going, and my mother's going to be upset, and I need to go home and spend time with my mother and family before I get called. And I did, and I was at the house one day, and we had this really obnoxious, mean little dachshund that had been our family pet forever. And she was, I forget how old she was, but she had like 2 teeth left. But she hated people coming to the house. She pretty much hated everyone. And we had I think this kind of got out of fashion, but we had a door that had a slot in it, and the mailman would actually walk up and put your mail through that slot. So I was home, and I heard Heidi barking and hollering at the mailman. I said, Heidi, geez, get it. And she would actually jump up and try to bite him as he put the mail in his hand. So I went over to pull her back and said, Heidi, get back. And there was a lot of mail. My head was bent over, and mail started landing on my head while I was trying to pull the dog back, and this one piece of mail landed right on my head, and I turned it over, and it was my draft notice. And so they gave me, and I forget, I went in, I think I went in on November 17th, which was 3 days before my birthday. So,
and what year would that be, 1970?
1970.
1970. Now, let's stop for one moment. So, what is your marital situation at this time? Are you still single?
Oh, yes. I was single.
Okay.
So,
But had you met your wife at that time? Because you both went to the same college, university.
I met my wife, Janae Von Essen, she did not start attending, she was from Texas, she didn't start attending the University of Missouri until her junior year. And for whatever reason, we didn't really have any of the same classes or meet until I think the last semester of my senior year, but we met then. and became very interested in each other. And we actually got married not too long after I went in the Army. We decided that I would go through, because we didn't know, nobody knew back then what was going to happen. But I went to basic training in Kentucky. Well, it's right on the Kentucky-Tennessee border, Fort Campbell, sort of up north of Nashville, but right on the border. And I knew I would be there for at least 8 weeks. And when I got there, I discovered that they actually closed the whole base for Christmas. So that extended for 2 weeks. So that extended it to 10 weeks or so in basic training. So and then it wasn't until after basic training you sort of found out what your next assignment would be. And I waited to find out, was that going to be overseas or was that going to be in the U.S.? And when it turned out it was going to be in the U.S., we decided to go ahead and get married. So we got married in March of 1971.
Now, there's an interesting story about that. Now, you had mentioned that, you had had a little musical exposure and had played baritone, uke, and then guitar. And you had about your prized possession at that point was this wonderful Martin guitar. Tell us about this guitar.
Well, for our viewers who know acoustic guitars, you'll probably know the name Martin, but Martin's a really old name in the guitar industry, made up in Pennsylvania, started back in 1833, and I had managed to acquire, just lucked out a good deal, a Martin D18 guitar, which was made with a certain kind of wood and had a wonderful sound, and I ended up selling that guitar to come up with enough money for us to get married. So whenever I did something stupid that would make Janae mad at me, which is fairly often, I would always say, well, at least, I sold that guitar so we could get married, so I must really love you. I mean, that's proof right there.
Tough for a musician to sell their D18 Martin guitar to buy a wedding ring and be able to afford to get married. I think that's a wonderful story.
Well, I clung to that all those years, but I didn't, to be honest, I was conflicted. I didn't really want to go in the Army, but I had made a decision that if I were called, I would go. I didn't agree with Vietnam, but, I felt, I had a duty, not trying to sound noble, but I did, and I think a lot of guys felt that way. I didn't want to go, but felt they had a duty, and so when called, I would go. But I didn't cause the sergeants any trouble in basic training, and pretty much did what I was told, and I sort of realized it was not going to be like all the fun in college and everything. But I remember that right at the end of your basic training, you basically have to go through a series of tests to prove that you learned what you needed to know, and in order to graduate from basic training. And I'll just say that although not the worst thing that can happen to you in the Army, basic training was not a lot of fun, and you would not want to have to do it twice. But for some reason, on the last day of this testing, you had to go out to the rifle range, and you had an M16, which was the weapon the Army used in Vietnam, and you had to be able to be proficient on that weapon before they would let you out of basic training. And when you have a rifle, you have to learn to sight it in. And I had done that. You use the same rifle the whole time in basic training. Well, I had done that, but something had happened when the rifle was stored, and the sight had gotten knocked loose, and I didn't, and was no longer properly sighted, and I didn't realize that, and so you had to make 31 of 40 shots had to hit not the bullseye, but this bullseye and a couple of circles out, and or you would have to repeat basic training, and then the drill sergeants, 2 of them would stand alongside you, and in their unique way, encourage you to do well. And I was trying my hardest, and I wasn't a great shot, but I was an okay shot the whole time, and I could not hit the target. And like the first 4 shots, like missed the target entirely. Then the next, 4 or 5 hit it, and the next 5 hit it, but outside the range that they would pass. And so the sergeant came over to me. I remember him very clearly, a guy from Tennessee. He'd already been back from Vietnam and had some authority when he talked about what things were like and what you had to be ready to do. So I paid attention to him. And he came over and he said, "Horner, all the brass is watching." He said, "What we used to do with somebody like you is I would fire your rifle and make sure you got your score. But I can't get away with it right now. And they're all watching because you've been so slow, you're last, and they'll see if we cheat. And you have to make all the remainder of your shots or you're going to be back here with us another 10 weeks. So, and probably, it was like somebody, one of the schools in North Carolina who makes all the foul shots at the end. I made the next 31 of 31 shots to just out of pure fear of having to repeat basic training, because I'd figured out, by trial and error, I'd figured out how to hit the target. I knew my rifle wasn't right, but I'd figured out what to do about it, and made 31 of 31. Got out with the lowest passing grade you could get in marksmanship, and they cheerfully kicked me out. I was on my way, but I was fortunate to get assigned. I think because of my University of Missouri journalism degree, I got assigned to the Signal Corps, and the Army has a name for everything or an acronym for everything. So I was a 71R, and in the Army way, where every letter is pronounced as a word, I was a 71 radio, because that kind of fit with being in the Signal Corps.
So tell us what the Signal Corps was for people that don't know.
Well, the Signal Corps did and still does, to the best of my knowledge, almost everything in the Army related to communications.
Communications, right.
So they string telephone wire, they handle radio communications, they do television productions for training films. If it has to do with communications, they do it. And I got sent down to Fort Gordon, Georgia, which was a Signal Corps headquarters. And that's kind of where I started the real part of my Army career. Lived in the barracks there for several months until I took leave and went home to the Falls Church, Virginia area, and that's when we got married. And if you were married, you were permitted to live off base. There were still certain nights you had to live in the barracks to be available for certain kinds of duties, but then we got a place in Augusta, Georgia, and actually living there, but obviously my job was on the base.
So while you were in the service and you were living in Augusta, what type of work was your wife engaged in?
She was still primarily interested in print reporting, so she jumped in and became a newspaper reporter, and had a really good set of assignments on the Augusta Chronicle, which was a daily newspaper. And
the reason I ask that is that you and your wife were really a team that developed into some things that we'll talk about here shortly, and it's very important to understand that in seeing the evolution of what happened to you as things go along.
Well, we had the way we always thought of it is we had sort of a mutual interest and a mutual career. The first part of our careers, we were normally on opposite sides, working for different news media in town, and we were kind of rivals. But later on, towards the middle and end of our careers, we ended up working for the same company.
So tell us what you did in the Signal Corps.
I got assigned, I had 2 different jobs at Fort Gordon. I got assigned to help make television training films, primarily on ways to repair equipment that you would use in the Signal Corps. And I did all those jobs. I ran camera. I helped with the videotaping and the editing. Now and then, there would have to be somebody to demonstrate whatever the piece of equipment was. And in the Army's way, although there were the experts on how to actually do it were right there on base, they preferred to have somebody in the Signal Corps sort of be their narrator. So I would have to learn how to repair a certain machine or learn enough about it that with the help of cue cards I could say, take this out, put this, move this to the left, never move that thing, and I would do those training films. And then after a while, I got transferred over to the other side of the base and basically wrote news releases and things about Fort Gordon for the local media.
So you're writing news releases and producing television or video clips, and your wife's working for the Augusta newspaper, and you're living off base, and everything's going along. Did you spend your entire military career there?
No. It was almost certain that I would go overseas, and one day I came back from the mess hall, and it was a fellow, I think at that point I was a corporal, basically, a specialist 4th class, I think. And one of my peers came out the back door of the little office that we used and said, oh man, I was really sorry to hear about your news. And I said, what news? He said, have you been in the office today? And I said, yeah, but I went to lunch. And he said, well, you might want to go in and talk to the colonel. So I went in and said, hey, this guy said I had some news. And he said, well, you're going to Korea. You're being assigned to Korea, and your last day is next week, and then you get these many days to get your life together and go over to Korea. And it was kind of, I sort of had mixed feelings because I wasn't going to Vietnam, but I still was going overseas, and he said, and one of the sergeants came up and said, hey, you're really lucky. First of all, you're not going to Vietnam, and secondly, Korea is the best kept secret in the Army, and you're really going to like your service there, and you'll do great. And don't worry about it; it's going to be fine. And I said, well, that's good to know. But then I had to go down, go home that night, and break it to my wife and everything. But I mean, she had known of a possibility, and overall it was good news, but it was still a big change.
Was she able to go with you?
No. They for Army people of my rank, dependents weren't allowed.
So what year was this when you were deployed to Korea?
Well, let's see. I got over there in '71. I guess it must have been September-ish, maybe of '71,
okay.
somewhere in there.
And what was your job there?
When I first got there, I was just somewhat vaguely assigned to Signal Corps duty with an infantry unit at, I can remember, Camp Tongdushan, which was up very close to the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, about which we hear so much in all the tension between the Koreas. And I wandered around the hills there and just did general duty there. That the mission of those folks there at that base would be to try to provide some resistance if the North Koreans came across. And so I, just was kind of at the ready and on patrol and all that. I thought the officers and were very good, and the sergeants were very good, and they were good to the troops and no complaints, and lived in a tent. The food was really pretty good, and it was cold. It was cold, but not but I never complained about it because people who were like in the real Army and in combat saw so much worse. But I don't know, I was up there a couple of months or something, and the Army had, believe it or not, had some system where you could find out about other positions and apply for them. And I looked on the bulletin board, and a position had come open for a newscaster back on the base in Seoul, the capital of South Korea, that was the main headquarters for the Army, and they needed a newscaster for American Forces Korea network, which involved radio newscasting and television newscasting. And I tell you who had left, Bob Edwards, who some of the viewers may remember as going on to fame on NPR. He had been doing that job and had just rotated out when he was being discharged. And I applied for that job and got to go down and interview the colonel, and or be interviewed by the colonel, and had to do some auditions and got it, and was able to transfer a month or so later and come back down and do those jobs until I left. So I was very fortunate to get that kind of duty for a couple of reasons. One, it was not quite as rigorous as being up on the DMZ, and two, it gave me some really valuable further experience that I could use later on in life.
Wow. So how long were you in Korea?
I not all that long, about a year. I came home, 72, well, maybe late in the summer, 72. I would have been there 6 months longer, but the Army used to do this now and then. They decided they had too many people in Korea, and if you were not a career Army guy, if you had been drafted, as I had been, and they knew you were not going to stay in the Army long term, those were the ones they tended to kick out and get rid of, because they felt you weren't really sort of an investment in their future anyway. And so I got sent home a little earlier than 6 months earlier than I had thought. So
were you discharged, or did you have other duties at home?
I was. They discharged us all. Flew back to the Oakland Army Air Terminal in Oakland, California, and landed, and was there maybe 4 or 5 days while you went through all this processing and filled out forms, and I think they checked your health to make sure you didn't have any communicable disease from over there, and gave you instructions on the transition period while you were literally going to be traveling home, and when their authority actually ended, and certain things you would need to do to stay in touch with the Army if you were going to be called back on active duty for any reason, that kind of thing. And then my wife at that point had moved to Austin, Texas, to be near her family nearby, in a little town out a couple hours from Austin, and they put me on a plane to Dallas, and I changed and flew to Austin, and they said you cannot take off your uniform till you're home. You have to wear your uniform all the way on any tickets the Army's paying for. If you get drunk on the plane, if you cause any trouble, you will be identified and picked up by the military police. And I said, well, that's pretty unlikely, because I think most of us are pretty happy to get out, and we're not going to jeopardize that, but kept that opinion to myself. But I got home, and everything went as it's supposed to. So that was sort of it for me in the military.
You moved to Texas.
Yep.
What happened then?
I worked at a radio station, KVET. It was actually the radio station that had been started by Lyndon Johnson and his wife, and a couple of other Texas politicians started that radio station. I worked there that summer in news, and got and then by that fall I had been accepted to get my master's degree at American University back home in Washington. So I decided to move back there. And
people may not realize LBJ and some partners owned several broadcast properties in that area quite substantially.
Yes, they was a good-sized broadcasting operation. I never met any member of their family, but met a number of their associates, and it was a well-run little radio station in Austin, very, as now, back then was a really interesting town and got to cover a lot of interesting stories.
So you go to get your master's.
Yep. I just felt that my career, I'd actually, when I got out of Korea, I decided I would go ahead and apply because in those days, you basically couldn't apply. There was no practical way to apply for a job from overseas. And when you got back, it was really hard to distinguish yourself from all these other GIs who were coming back. And I just reached the conclusion, wrong or right, that I wasn't going to be able to get a full-time job applying literally from Korea. And that, and because I knew I was not a true academic, I said, you know, if I'm ever going to get a master's degree, which I think may help me sometime, I might as well do it now while my career hasn't really gotten going yet because of my Army service. So I decided to go ahead and you know, go to AU.
And let's talk about technology and communication for a minute while you were in Korea. You know, World War II was a 35 millimeter war. All the news coverage that we had during that time was shot on 35 millimeter tape,
Yep.
was developed,
Right.
Came back on a plane, and several days later,
Right.
you could see it. Vietnam and Korea were videotape wars.
Yep.
All the images were shot on videotape and came back on a plane, and then we would get them the next day. I'm not sure there were satellite uplinks. There may or may not have been. But my question is, how did you communicate with your family? Could you call? Today, service members in 2017, if they have someone overseas, sometimes they can call them on a cell phone, even if they're in the Middle East or places like that. How did you communicate with your family when you were in Korea?
I wrote letters, something called the mail, and they wrote letters back to me, and they would take, it seems to me, 2 weeks either way. The Army Post Office was a great operation. You could write all the time. They were great about getting your mail delivered. They were great. I mean, when you got mail from your family, it got to you. When you sent something, it got to them. They were great. They were very popular. Obviously, everybody was always glad to see the mail guy coming around and handing out mail. And I recall that at Christmas time, I don't know the right name of the union, although I might need some help here, but it was like the American Federation of Musicians, I think.
It is.
A musical union. Out of the goodness of their hearts, as a project, a charitable project, out of appreciation for the Army, or for the military, I should say, the entire military, they would sponsor, they would pay for a phone call to your family. So you would go down to a certain place that they set up, and you could make, I think it was like a 5-minute phone call to your family.
Wow.
And then you would hang up and then hand the phone to the next guy, and he could call. So I remember one phone call that, due to their kindness, when I was in the Army, and everything else was the U.S. mail.
Wow. That must have been really something.
Yeah.
Be able to call home.
Yeah, no, it was great. It was great.
So,
I think I actually made it 2 calls, which you could, like, as long as you didn't go
Within
over
your
5 minutes.
5 minutes,
I called Janae and my wife and talked mainly to her, and then a quick hello to my mother, so I could maintain decent relations with
you're
my
a good
parents.
son and a good husband.
Well, I knew Mom would be upset if she learned I could have called and didn't. So
you get your master's.
Yeah.
What happened after that?
Well, I hadn't really started my career yet, and Janae had been great by working at a newspaper in Washington while I was getting my master's, and the GI Bill money finally showed up, and I was working 3 part-time jobs, but it was still really hard to make it, and so she'd been great in helping me get through. And then we both loved the West, and we decided, she decided that she wanted to go west, and I really wanted to go west. And although I had opportunities to stay in Washington, and you think being from Washington, and and having got my master's in Washington and having worked for newspapers in Washington, that I would have done the logical thing and stayed there and gotten a job in Washington. But for whatever reason, I don't know how old I was then. I was 24 or something maybe, but I maybe it's my time in Missouri or maybe in Korea, but I knew that that Washington was its own fascinating, colorful place, but it actually wasn't a lot like the rest of the country. And I felt that I really wanted to have the opportunity to experience the rest of the country. I thought that would be important for a journalist. And that was my feeling, but Janae wanted to go west, and she had similar feelings, and she got a offer of basically a full scholarship, fellowship kind of thing to get her master's degree at the University of Wyoming, and so we picked up and moved to Laramie, Wyoming.